What a day, what a day. Today is June the 12th, and she is back, because in June the 12th, 1429, the Battle of Jargeau takes place, with Jeanne of Arc at the helm of the French army, recapturing the city taken by the English. So, our favorite heroine is back, and what is relevant about this battle, while not being a huge one, is that of the Hundred-Year War, it's not that the French were having a good time. For a long tract of the war, it was the English who had the advantage. But, as you can see, starting from the Siege of Orléans, which the French were able to lift and defend from the English, the Battle of Jargeau is relevant because it was the first offensive battle since the siege, and essentially it was the comeback of the French, the start of the comeback of the French. And stay tuned, because I have a feeling in the next few days we're gonna have some reruns of our dear Jeanne. Now, staying a little bit on history, today is Shallow Speculation Saturday. That's right. What we're going to talk about today, what I am going to talk about today, is some inane ramblings of what I think, possibly what I hope is going to happen in 9.1. For the good of the people, of course. I am being completely altruistic here, and I have no second motives or no agendas pushed by my own. And the what's happening in question is related to the classes and the specs that are going to be played in 9.1. At the end of the day, that's what most people are going to be focused on when 9.1 comes in. Sure, you have flying, that's cool. Sure, there is going to be a new raid, that's also cool. Mythic Plus, the interest in Mythic Plus is going to be refreshed, at least for a few weeks, for a few months maybe, because of the new affix, the new seasonal affix, as well as the new way of Keystone Master and the whole score system is going to work with both Fortified and Tyrannical. So, as usual, as it happens with a new big patch, there is going to be a bunch new things to try out. But, of course, you have to try them out playing a class and playing a spec. And I have been told, I didn't know about this, I have been told that certain people playing certain specs might have a more difficult time to essentially be part of these new discoveries, of this new content. For example, let's just say a random spec that comes to mind, Survival Hunter. Just, naming one. It could have been any other spec, by the way. But, if you play in Survival Hunter, you might have more troubles and more problems in exploring all this content, right? Now, of course, I won't be the one to tell you, be a meta slave, play only what people tell you is the strongest, otherwise you won't ever play the game. That's just not true. But, there are varying degrees of truth. Truth is kind of relative. And in this case, no, you shouldn't play meta every single time, but sometimes you should make sure that you're going to have a way of exploring and trying out everything that's in the game, particularly if you're alone, particularly if you don't have a very extended group of friends or players, people to play with. It's going to be even harder. I don't think people have too many issues raiding as a Mistweaver Monk if they are already in a guild who is already letting them raid as a Mistweaver Monk. On the other hand, if you're a new player or a player who decided he wants to start raiding, the decision of I am going to find a guild that is going to let me raid as a Mistweaver Monk is going to be a much harder hassle. So to cap this recap of Shallow Speculation Saturday, I am going to talk about which specs are going to be played in 9.1. There is absolutely zero evidence that any of this mentioned will be true. This is only observing the current popularity of the specs in the game, as well as the balance tuning and the balance changes that Blizzard is applying in 9.1, or at least they are scheduled to happen in 9.1. Things like, Affliction nerfs, Balance Druid nerfs, Fire Mage nerfs, Shadow Priest nerfs, and then react accordingly. Also, some things like the new affix in Mythic Plus might change some of the priority of the specs. So, some predictions are in order. And to continue the tradition of YouTube content creators or streamers, if these predictions end up being correct, I am going to remind you of them for every single video thereon. If they are wrong, this video is going to be deleted, and everyone who mentioned this will be banned from my channel. You can't get banned from my channel, but I will find a way. When it comes to tanks, Well, there is no reason, there is no purpose of playing this conservative. After all, this is a shallow speculation, so in 9.1 Guardian Druid will become much more popular. I have this feeling that with the anima powers, especially some of the tanky powers like being able to take less magical damage, as well as tankiness and resistances together with the extra healer powers that allow you to be more powerful in single target healing with the mana conservation, or rather the mana regeneration powers you can get, I think big mega pulls are going to be more viable. Not Legion level, not pull the entire dungeon before the first boss and then pull the entire dungeon before the second boss and then pull the entire dungeon before the third boss, like in Legion, but big enough pulls that are going to put enough value on cooldowns like Incarnation. The whole power of Vengeance comes from having 1 minute short cooldowns. So if you end up being in a meta where it is possible to, rather than pull big enough for a 1 minute pull, to be able to pull big enough for a 2 minute cooldown or for a 3 minute cooldown, then you do have specs that have power in that, like Guardian Druid with Incarnation. It's a 3 minute cooldown, but it is extremely powerful. It is the strongest tank cooldown. If you are talking about a theoretical pull where you can use your biggest cooldowns together, then Guardian Druid with Ursoc's Fury Remembered to get a shield from thrash damage and Incarnation becomes basically the immortal tank for like 30 seconds, which is massive. So that would be my speculation and my prediction for tanks. That doesn't mean that Vengeance will fall out of flavor completely. It doesn't mean it will be weaker. As a matter of fact, the nerfs for Vengeance have been all passed already. You know, we went through a few weeks between 9.0 and 9.0.5 where Vengeance has gotten quite a few nerfs. And yes, it did change the way Vengeance was popular, but not really that much. It was still the clearly more represented tank. But I do think there is going to be a change in 9.1, and that's my prediction. Now, when it comes to healers, of course, I have no conflict of interest here. And to prove it, I will say that Holy Paladin will continue to rise and to grow in power, but that is still too much of a safe call. It's not risky enough, we have to find something else to call. So I guess if I had to make the extra call in here, would have to be Restoration Druid. What is the reasoning behind this call? Well, the reasoning behind this call is that I hold the idea, I hold the theory that you can only be popular in Mythic Plus as a healer if you have damage. My idea before, I would have shielded, I would have propped up and advertised Holy Priest. I am really up on Holy Priest, but, however, their damage is pathetic. They still have the problem of many other specs like Restoration Shaman that they can't do damage while healing, which means when you enter Mythic Plus, that is going to be a big problem. So the only other spec I see be able to swiftly change from healing to doing damage is Restoration Druid. There is the option of Mistweaver, which has gotten its Fist Weaving buffed, so they do more damage, but still not enough. One of the strong points of healers be able to do DPS is that they can convert one of their cooldowns to do burst damage. Fist Weaving monks don't really have that. Even if you buffed their overall damage by 15 to 20%, they still don't have a big cooldown. A paladin has Avenging Wrath, even Avenging Crusader, they can use to stockpile their damage on top of their damage on top of their damage. They even have Ashen Hallow for Ventir. Restoration Druids have Convoke the Spirits with Heart of the Wild. That's burst. No other specs, no other healer specs have the ability to dish out this type of burst. So if I had to look at this from a Mythic Plus lens, I would have to say Restoration Druid. I still think the nerfs given to Holy Paladin are irrelevant. Getting your damage nerfed by roughly 20% is not going to achieve anything, because if your damage is on average 5 times higher than your opponents, then your counterparts, a 20% nerf is not going to be enough. When it comes to raiding, I haven't touched raiding for tanks because that's irrelevant. Tanks are not going to be picked in raids because of their power, mostly because of their debuffs and how they can fill the rest of the raid, generally. When it comes to raiding, no change. My shallow speculation is not even shallow and is likely not even going to be a speculation. When it comes to raids, you still need damage reduction, you still need strong cooldowns, and Discipline Priest, Restoration Shaman, and Holy Paladin are still going to be your de facto healers. I was looking at the boss fights in Sanctum of Domination to see if we would have lacked some of those very heavy damage windows. So instead of having periods of 10 out of 10 damage taken and then downward period with 4 out of 10 damage taken, which of course encourages huge damage reduction cooldowns like Barrier and Spirit Link, if we could have gotten something like a consistent 8 out of 10 damage taken, so that throughput, HPS, continuous healing would have been stronger, because you simply don't have a super value moment to drop down your Spirit Link or your Barrier, and instead you have a 7-minute long fight where you want to continuously push down healing. That would be the perfect scenario for a Resto Druid or a Holy Priest. I haven't found enough of these fights in Sanctum of Domination to warrant growth of HPS of throughput healers, so that's the prediction for 9.1. Now, when it comes to the clusterfuck of DPS, when it comes to melee DPS, some people are wondering about Unholy Death Knights. Maybe you had people wanting to reroll to Unholy because it was strong, because they were sick and tired of being sidelined as a melee, not finding a spot in a raid as a melee, so they wanted to go Unholy, and then Anti-Magic Zone got nerfed. Unholy Death Knight already started dipping a little bit in damage after they received a couple of back-to-back nerfs at the start of this expansion, including a hurtful one to their mastery. That saw a direct nerf to their scaling that would have been pretty hurtful over time, over the months and the item levels. So I'm going to go for the call. This newly nerfed anti-magic zone is not going to be powerful enough to warrant it in a raid. Even with the lessening of the nerf applied by Blizzard, is still not enough. It's no longer a damage reduction, so you're not going to get a free spot anymore simply because you have anti-magic zone in the raid. And I don't think the damage after the nerfs of Unholy is going to continue to be impressive enough that you just want to stack a bunch of them. I think the call for 9.1 is that Fury Warrior and Assassination Rogues are going to be the way to go. Fury Warrior has good enough cleave and consistent AoE to be used for those fights, and Assassination as the best single target of all melee DPS. So, in my perfect world, you're gonna have something like 2 Assassination Rogues, 2 Fury Warriors, and then 1 Havoc Demon Hunter. Because they are too popular to not have them in a raid, and also because at least they bring you darkness in the raid. A small-ish defensive you can bring for the rest of the raid, for the rest of the group. And that's it. 5 melee is more than enough. That would be the bold prediction. I'm actually gonna go even bolder and just point out that Frost DK is going to outscale Unholy DK, given the nerf to the mastery of Unholy. Generally, before that nerf, I think Unholy would have been able to keep up at an okay level with Frost DK, but with the nerf, especially with Frost DK getting its mastery change to scale with Killing Machine, to scale with Obliterate, I think it's gonna overtake Unholy over time. I don't see any other melee spec rising up to get any reason to be invited to a raid, to get a spot. Survival Hunter has no reason to. You have Enhancement Shaman, also no reason to. Windwalker Monk, unless you are lacking a Brewmaster Monk tank for the debuff, also no reason. Red Paladin is the same, so that would be my situation for melee DPS. That was the take in raid encounters though. What about Mythic Plus for melee DPS? Because in Mythic Plus you have Havoc, you have Outlaw Rogue, and you have Windwalker Monk, and a little bit lower down you have Unholy Death Knight. Is there going to be any other spec rising up, trying to combat them? Maybe Fury Warrior, which has also risen quite a bit. Well, outside of the call of Fury Warrior, getting progressively more relevant in raids, and as a result having more chances of being popular also in Mythic Plus, simply because of its play rate, I don't think there is going to be too much of a change. Even with Prideful removed, you still have a lot of uses for your Shroud. In Mythic Plus, it's still very helpful. The damage type of Outlaw is still very powerful. With the removal of Prideful and a single target focused mini-boss, Outlaw is by reflection having more value because they are not that powerful in single target. So if you remove Prideful, they're just going to gain some value by themselves, since the mini-bosses are not going to take as much time and they're not going to be as dangerous as a Prideful. So on a similar note, I don't think in Mythic Plus there is going to be that big of a change, that big of a shift in popularity. For the last spot, you have the range DPS. The range DPS are a pretty interesting situation because the strongest and the best performing range DPS are Balanced Druid, Shadow Priest, Fire Mage, and Affliction Warlock. And the 4 specs that are getting nerfed in 9.1 are Balanced Druid, Shadow Priest, Fire Mage, and Affliction Warlock. So the top 4 specs for raids and the top 3 specs for Mythic Plus, so Fire, Balance, and Shadow, are all getting nerfed, which means you have room for takeovers, right? One of the takeover, which has been clearly, heavily hinted, and you already saw it in the last official tournament of Mythic Plus, the Great Push, Elemental Shaman is being propped up for being on the rise for both Raid encounters and Mythic Plus, because the buff they have received is very powerful in AoE. They already had a very competitive single target damage with their Lava Resurgence legendary in single target for Raid encounters, and then with this overall buff to AoE, to their Chain Lightning and their Earthquake, their numbers are just higher now. So you see them much higher in overall damage, you see them much higher in AoE. They have a self-combat rest, they have a bloodlust, they have a bunch of utility to use in Mythic Plus, so it is a legitimate, healthy prediction to make that Elemental Shaman is going to become more relevant in Mythic Plus, and is going to continue to be strong in Raid Encounters. So the question is, what about the ones that are getting nerfed? Are they actually going to lose a lot of priority in Raid Encounters? I don't think Shadow Priest and Affliction Warlock will, because even with their nerfs, they're getting nerfed in single target, so maybe they might be overtaken by other specs with stronger single target, like Elemental Shaman. But their power shifting in dots, in higher damage on multi-dotting and spread cleaving, can still be very powerful in Raid Encounters, particularly because they are the only ones with that type of damage profile. Which means whenever there is a fight with more than 2 targets further away from each other that cannot be cleaved by your normal spec, like cleaved by an Earthquake, cleaved by a multi-shot, and a Beast Cleave, cleaved by a Flame Strike. So whenever the targets are further away than that, Shadow Priest and Affliction Warlock will be a must, possibly even Balanced Druid. Then you have to talk about the nerfs to Balanced Druid, their nerfs to Starfall. So the much lower damage they're going to have because of the uptime of Starfall is going to become much worse given the nerfs, as well as the nerfs to their burst getting nerfed as well, together with the overall damage of Fire Mage getting nerfed, their combustion having a roughly 15-second longer cooldown, and overall less damage of their AoE, 10% less damage on their AoE. I do not think Arcane Mage is in a good enough shape, in a buffed enough shape to overtake Fire Mage in Raid Encounters, certainly not in Mythic Plus. When it comes to Frost Mage, I do... do I wanna say this? Do I wanna risk it? I do think they can overtake Fire Mage in Mythic Plus. The longer cooldown on combustion plus the nerf to their AoE hurts them quite a lot in Mythic Plus, and it's not that Frost Mage was doing little damage in Mythic Plus already. So with these changes, I think Frost Mage could gain a lot of value. In Raid Encounters, I still think it's too strong, because the power of the burst, the power of combustion in Raid Encounters is still too strong. You have too many windows, too many moments where you want dedicated burst to do damage on a particular ad or a particular boss phase that you want to end quickly. So cooldowns are always going to have a lot of value in that moment. And even with a nerfed combustion, Fire Mage is still one of the only few range DPS with very, very powerful burst. You have Balanced Druid, which is getting nerfed. Shadow Priest, Affliction Warlock, Destruction, Demonology don't have a as powerful burst, and when they have it, the cooldown is much longer. So even if you do have the burst, it's gonna take much longer for you to use it again, even with the nerf to the cooldown of combustion. When it comes to Mythic Plus, you have to talk about Balanced Druid because they still have 3 ends. So yes, you might have gotten your Starfall nerfed, you might have gotten some of your talents like Solstice and passive damage getting nerfed, but you still have 3 ends, so you are basically still a functioning Mythic Plus spec. There is no alternative to 3 ends. The Cardboard Assassin has essentially been removed from the game and removed from usability after getting its level reduced from 60 to 35. After getting its cooldown shared with potions, it becomes super hard to find a way to use this in a Mythic Plus key, which means the only saving grace for tanks is now 3 ends. Yes, Elemental Shaman is growing in popularity and power, which means Earth Elemental can also save tanks. However, Earth Elemental is nowhere near the power of 3 ends. The only power that Earth Elemental has that can tie to a 3 end is when there is 1 or 2 targets, tops. Otherwise, the Earth Elemental is going to die in roughly 5 seconds when you pull it out. So for my shallow speculation, I'm going to say that Destruction Warlock is going to continue to gain popularity and power, especially in Mythic Plus. I am going to refuse to elaborate on this subject and leave. That's just my feeling of the spec. together with Beast Mastery Hunter. It is written in the stars that the deeper you go into the expansion, the stronger Beast Mastery is going to become over Marksmanship, and Marksmanship has gotten beaten down quite a lot over the course of this expansion after getting its hotfix to Wild Spirits. So I believe that eventually Beast Mastery Hunter is going to overtake Marksmanship. Whereas closing out these unfounded predictions, I would say Shadow Priest and Affliction will not gain as much of a focus for Mythic Plus. I think they will become worse in Mythic Plus. Some people might think they are stronger because now their dots are more powerful, but no. Dots are still too weak in Mythic Plus because the mobs die too quickly and you don't have a way to accelerate the damage of your dots. You can just throw them down on the enemies, but then you can't really capitalize on the damage. You have Affliction, which has Malefic Rapture now to capitalize on the dots, but Malefic Rapture is also counted as your single target ability, which is what is getting nerfed in 9.1. Shadow Priest has nothing at all. Even if you spread Vampiric Touch and Shadow War Pain to the entirety of the pack, you still have nothing to gain on this, to capitalize on this for AoE. You're just stuck spamming Searing Nightmare. So I don't think they will gain any extra value in Mythic Plus. I think their dot power will only take effect in raid encounters. Now this was all for the Speculation Saturday. I have my beliefs in Guardian Druid as a tank, rise of Restoration Druid in Mythic Plus, but nothing else when it comes to raid encounters due to how the boss fights are designed. And then for melee and range DPS, I have some stocks, not too many, but some stocks on Frost Decay becoming more powerful than Unholy Death Knight. No other melee DPS spec gaining any value in raid encounters. The only change would be Unholy losing the value because of the nerfing of AMZ. Assassination and Fury will continue to scale and continue to become more popular in raid encounters, whereas for Mythic Plus, your run-of-the-mill AoE heavy, very consistent damage specs like Outlaw, like Fury, like Havoc, and like Windwalker will continue to be very popular. No other spec will take over their roles. And then lastly, you have range DPS, where it is still the big question mark about balance, Shadow, Affliction, and Fire, and their nerfs. I think for raid encounters, it is not going to hurt too much, Shadow and Affliction, because the shifting of their damage profile can still be very powerful in Mythic raiding, but not as much in Mythic Plus. Whereas when it comes to balance and Fire, I think Fire is going to be hurt. Fire is going to be eventually outscaled by Frost Mage, but likely not soon enough to happen in 9.1, at the very least at the start. If it will happen, I think it's going to happen in Mythic Plus with Frost Mage. When it comes to Balance Druid, I think they will lose the value, they will lose the power in raid encounters. They might even be, let's say, supplanted and replaced with something like an Elemental Shaman, but in Mythic Plus, the power of their 3 ends can still keep them alive, can still keep them powerful enough to be wanted and needed in Mythic Plus keys. And lastly, you have the dichotomy of Marksmanship versus Beast Mastery, where I think eventually over time Beast Mastery is going to take over, perhaps even actually from the start of 9.1. The difference, the gap between the two is shorter than the gap between Fire and Frost Mage, so it's likely that Beast Mastery will accelerate the process. Thank you guys anyways for watching the video. I would suggest anyone, especially the fans of Jeanne d'Arc, to subscribe to the channel. If you don't, it's expected. You are a filthy, perfidious Albion supporter. You probably had a hand yourself in the capturing of Jeanne d'Arc, so I don't want you in this channel. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, yes, I failed my contractual obligation. I actually mentioned survival in this video, so my job is done.